محاضرة عن Exoticism, Identity and Representation in Western Translation from Arabic. The outline, introduction, Exoticism, literal versus three approaches, two approaches, translation from Arabic, and conclusion. Translating involves not just two languages, but a transfer from one culture to another. General cultural differences are sometimes bigger obstacles to successful translation than linguistic differences. The various degree of cultural transposition can be visualized as points along a scale between the extremes of exoticism, cultural transposition, and cultural transplantation. And this image will illustrate the point. So, source culture bias, target culture bias, exoticism and cultural borrowing, communicative translation, cultural transposition. Exoticism, foreignness. A target text marked by exoticism is one which constantly uses grammatical and cultural features imported from the source text with minimal adaptation. It constantly signals the exotic source culture and its cultural strangeness. Here, a sample of exoticism in translation from Arabic would be a more or less literal translation of the following simple conversation. Here, literal translation, standard Arabic. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Wa alaikum salam, and upon you be peace. كيف الحال? How is the state? Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah. Literal versus free approach. Especially when dealing with literal translation of culturally distant cultures and language, it becomes apparent that there are no easy or consistent solutions. The debate is still centered on the appropriateness of literal versus free approaches. Foreignizing, that is, there are two approaches. Number one, foreignizing, that is importing alien elements to the target culture, which are supposed to belong to the source culture. For example, by use of loan words called the discursive structure of the original. The target text may thus be said to enter, as a result of the translation process, into the target culture and to belong there from there. Oh. From within the culture, the reader plays an active role in conferring an acceptable and coherent sense onto the text. The reader collaborates with author and text alike. This does not mean that the translator always substitutes familiar references for foreign ones. No, which may be the case in certain texts, where those references are secondary to the purpose of the translation. Bible translation, for example, but rather the opposite is true, particularly in literary translation from language such as Arabic, where references to alien concepts or customs are usually preserved and somehow clarified in the translated text or explained in footnotes. Taking newness always involves an adaptation, a negotiation, the establishment of a common ground, or a mediating space. But given that it is difficult to determine the exact nature of such personal terrain, no two interpretations are the same. Approaches do change from one culture to another and from one intercultural network to another. Drawing on translation from Arabic into Spanish, the case for some exoticism in translating from Arabic may be necessary. For strict dichotomies, foreignization versus domestication, for example, do not seem to be flexible enough for either the theorist or the practitioners. Translation from Arabic into Spanish is paradigmatic in the sense that context setting where interaction takes place is different from that adapted for other languages. Salvador Bina, a Spanish translatologist and translator from Arabic and English purposes, a translation typology organized in terms of their relationship existing between codes. Draw a distinction between two ways of translating according to the hierarchical or hegemonic relationship that may be established between two or more languages. Glossing, if we descend down the hierarchical ladder in terms of which languages are thought of in a given social situation, VGR translating from English into Spanish, or disfering in the case we climbed up the ladder, VGR translating from Arabic into French. The usual literalism or foreignization that is taken for granted in translation of the Arabian Nights, Alif Layla wa Layla, where, for example, Al-Malik Said becomes in Spanish Ayoria Feliz, or Happy King in English. Although no one would accept a queen to address her husband in such a way, unless that the queen is Shahrazad. It is in some respects an inflation of meaning, which is intended as an elevation of the obvious loss of cultural facts, but which in fact replaces some others that occlude, even annul, or openly contradict the original one. This inflation may, however, be necessary to make sense of new realities or experiences. There is a crisis in cultural translation theory due particularly to number one, the sheer difficulty in coping with an enormous, largely redundant amount of cultural theory being developed in many fields. Number two, the reticence of cultural translation theorists and cultural criticism at large to identify the linguistic mechanisms by which discourse is in the end enacted. What is needed is a semiotic theory that takes into account the pragmatic implication of using socially established images of the other, exotic, translation generally produces what target readers expect. In the case of Arabic, ethnocentric translators domesticate the literature and its associated culture. Foreignness is limited in any given discursive construction conveyed by a text, a conversation, a series of advertising images, a photographic exhibition, etc. We cannot expect everything to be known or familiar, nor conclude that everything appears to us foreign, alien, odd, or strange. Cultural identity may be constructed from a number of semiotic signs. In the case of social or geographical varieties, sociolinguistics tells us that speakers recognize and identify only a few features of language as representative of a particular dialect or social group. Most other traits remain hidden and fluctuate until they generalize enough to become stereotypes. Similarly, the creation of cultural identities through translation is usually limited to relatively few stereotypes. Few details suffice to distinguish, for example, the speech of a cultured gentleman from that of a peasant. Ethnic differences in translation are usually treated in the same way, drawing on the common target culture repertoire of ethnic linguistic stereotypes. When there is a parallel distinction in the target language culture, or else the translator provides substitutes, Cuban Spanish for Jamaican English as in the movie The Little Mermaid. English or Spanish reader usually classify in advance what they may encounter in work translated from Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, or Malay. That is, they formulate a number of expectations as to the description of the foreign and exotic settings and their categories, so certain themes and discursive features are expected and a specimen of a specific genre is expected. Exotic literature. The translator, far from being invisible, usually positions himself or herself before the translated work and intervenes in introductions, glossaries, and footnotes. One simple example that illustrates the need for adopting a double strategy in translating a text that contains a cultural specific elements can be shown in the following sentences. When an Arabic person receives good news, he or she usually says هذا الخبر أثلج صدري, the literal rendering of which into English can read as this news snowed my chest. Obviously, the English target text conveys no sense and sounds exotic to the English reader. However, the translation of the above Arabic text into English, this news warmed my heart, would convey the right and intended sense to the target reader and would read well to him or her. Sometimes the nature of the source text makes it virtually impossible to avoid exoticism. In the target text, consider the following from the classic Arabic text Al-Bukhala by Al-Jahid. in which formal features such as parallelism or in chapter 11 are extremely important in the source text but are not easily matched by typical formal features of English. Here وليس من أصل الأدب ولا في ترتيب الحكم ولا في عادات القادة ولا في تدبير السادة أن يستوي في نفيس المأكول وغريب المشروب وثمين الملبوس وخطير المركوب والناعم من كل فن والذباب من كل شيء التابعة والمتبوع والسيدة والمسود. Here the translation, it is not consistent with the principles of etiquette, the hierarchy of authority, the customs of leaders, and the good rule of princes, that the follower and the followed, the ruler and the ruled become equals with respect to precious food and marvelous drinks, valuable clothes and noble horses, and the finest and best kind of. These are also new examples. ذهبت إلى الإسكندرية عبر الطريق الصحراوي أحبه أكثر من الطريق الزراعي الذي يمر عبر قرى وبلاد الدلتا الرطيبة الموخمة. I traveled to Alexandria through the desert road. I prefer it to the fields road, which goes through the villages and the monotonous, unhealthy lands of the Delta. This text provides the reader with a feeling of disquiet, which springs from the unexpected connotations of non-cultural realities. Cambina, countryside, fields, has positive connotation and is associated with the green, luscious landscape, not normally with the orchard landscape on found in the Nile Delta, while in accordance with the author's seemingly incongruous preference for a desolated route, the translator's option reverses, deconstructs, or deconstructs, or even interrupts. Conclusion. Exoticism ideologies in translation should be analyzed through an interdisciplinary approach, combining semiotic, discourse analysis, and cultural criticism. Domestication foreignization is a confusing and simplistic dichotomy. Literary translations from so-called exotic cultures often resort to literalist foreignizing to prop up exotic, ethnocentric stereotypes. Minoritizing translation strategies are fairly difficult. Translation strategies are fairly difficult to control and may produce undesirable results. These are the references that this research used to elaborate on the problem of this. These are the other